There is a story buried beneath the story you were told. A story hidden between the lines of Genesis, woven into forbidden gospels, whispered through temples, mystery schools, and the quiet intuition of countless women who felt there was something more, something sacred, beneath the versions of scripture that survived the flames of history. It is the story of the divine feminine the world was never meant to remember. Not one woman, but 3 archetypes, 3 mirrors, 3 lost faces of feminine power: Lilith, Eve, Magdalene, each condemned, rewritten, or diminished, not because they were weak, but because they represented a force too expansive, too untamed, too liberating for the systems that rose after them. Lilith, the rebel, the untamed soul, the primordial feminine who refused to kneel. Eve, the seeker, the awakener, the one who chose knowledge over obedience. Magdalene, the initiate, the teacher, the sacred consort whose voice was buried to preserve the illusion of a purely masculine spiritual authority. 3 women, 3 myths, 3 suppressed pathways to sovereignty and inner illumination. Ask yourself this: what if the sin of these women was not rebellion, desire, or temptation, but remembering their power? What if their stories were not warnings, but maps, coded teachings pointing to the lost balance between the masculine and feminine, the human and divine, the self and the soul? And what if reclaiming these stories today is not simply an act of historical curiosity, but a spiritual necessity, because the suppression of the feminine has left our world fractured, imbalanced, and spiritually half asleep? In this video, we will venture into the shadows of ancient scripture, mystic traditions, and esoteric philosophy to uncover what the original stories of Lilith, Eve, and Magdalene were meant to teach. We will explore why their voices were silenced, what their archetypes reveal about the journey of awakening, and how these suppressed truths can reshape the way you understand your own inner power, regardless of your gender. This is not a retelling, it is a remembering. To understand why Lilith, Eve, and Magdalene were fragmented, rewritten, or buried entirely, we must step back into an older world, one where spiritual traditions were not yet dominated by rigid hierarchies, and the divine feminine flowed openly through temples, myths, and sacred rites. Long before the Abrahamic religions took shape, ancient cultures across Mesopotamia, Egypt, Canaan, and the Mediterranean revered a dual principle of creation: the masculine force of order and the feminine force of life, intuition, and mystery. The goddess had many names: Inanna, Ishtar, Hathor, Isis, Astarte, Asherah, and she stood not as a passive figure, but as a sovereign being. She was creativity, sensuality, chaos, wisdom, fertility, destruction, and rebirth all at once. But as patriarchal structures rose and centralized power reshaped spiritual narratives, something monumental occurred. The feminine was not merely forgotten, it was systematically erased. It began with Lilith. Her earliest appearance was not as a demon, but as a powerful night goddess of autonomy and magic woven into Sumerian myths. In later Judaic tradition, she became Adam's first partner, equal, independent, and unwilling to submit. This was a problem for the new spiritual order that demanded obedience and hierarchy. So Lilith was recast from a symbol of feminine sovereignty into a demon of chaos, child-stealing, and seduction, a warning against women who would not comply. Then came Eve. But the Eve we know today is not the Eve of the earliest texts. In ancient mystical interpretations, Eve is not a temptress, but a bringer of consciousness, the force that catalyzed humanity's evolution. Her sin was an act of awakening, not disobedience. Yet as institutional religion took shape, Eve's story was rewritten into a myth of guilt, shame, and female culpability. Her curiosity, once sacred, became an inherited flaw. Her desire for knowledge, once revered, became humanity's downfall. And then there is Mary Magdalene. Her suppression is perhaps the most deliberate. In early Christian communities, Magdalene was honored as a spiritual teacher, confidant, and perhaps even the mirror soul of Jesus. The Gnostic Gospels, those banned texts hidden for nearly 2,000 years, portray her as the disciple who understood the teachings on a deeper, more mystical level than the others. But as the church solidified its authority, a female teacher with access to esoteric knowledge became an existential threat. So Magdalene was reduced to a repentant prostitute, a sinner redeemed by Christ rather than a partner in his work. 3 women, 3 archetypes, each carrying a piece of the divine feminine that patriarchy needed to suppress. Lilith's independence, Eve's awakening, Magdalene's wisdom. Their stories were not silenced because they were unimportant, but because they were dangerous. Dangerous to the idea that spirituality must flow through male authority. Dangerous to the belief that obedience is holier than liberation. Dangerous to any system that thrives on keeping humanity spiritually incomplete. But the truth is this: history cannot fully erase archetypes. They resurface across cultures, across eras, across the psyche itself, because they represent something fundamental about the human soul. The divine feminine is not a concept. It is a living principle woven into consciousness, waiting to be remembered. To truly understand why Lilith, Eve, and Magdalene matter, not as historical figures but as spiritual archetypes, we must look beneath their stories and into the symbolic architecture hidden within them. These women are not just characters in ancient texts. They are mirrors of 3 stages of awakening within every human being. Their stories form a coded map, a journey the soul takes as it moves from innocence to rebellion to revelation. Let us begin with Lilith, for all spiritual evolution starts with a question, an inner refusal to accept a version of yourself that does not feel true. In esoteric tradition, Lilith represents the first spark of individuality, the moment a soul realizes it has agency. She is the primordial self who chooses authenticity over approval, even when the world demands submission. In the earliest stories, Lilith leaves Eden because she refuses to lie beneath Adam. Symbolically, this is the moment the self refuses to live beneath an identity imposed upon it. Lilith's departure from Eden is not an act of defiance. It is an act of selfhood. Her myth tells us that awakening begins when we step away from what does not honor our inner truth. But this path is not gentle. It is often accompanied by exile, social, emotional, or spiritual. That is why Lilith is demonized, not because she was evil, but because liberation terrifies systems built on control. Then comes Eve, the next stage of awakening. If Lilith is the spark of selfhood, Eve is the spark of consciousness. Eve's role has been tragically misunderstood. She is not a villain. She is the embodiment of curiosity, intuition, and the desire to know what lies beyond imposed limitations. The fruit she eats symbolizes insight, a shift in perception that cannot be undone. The serpent, often demonized, traditionally represents the Kundalini, the creative life force, the spiral of evolving awareness. In this light, the fall is not humanity's descent into sin, but humanity's ascension into awareness, accompanied by the painful birth of duality, light and shadow, self and other, life and mortality. Eve's story is the moment consciousness wakes up and says, "There is more. I must know." And knowledge, once tasted, cannot be returned. Awareness always comes with consequence. When you awaken to deeper truths, you cannot remain in the garden of ignorance, not because you are punished, but because you have outgrown it. Which leads us to Mary Magdalene, the 3rd stage of awakening. If Lilith is autonomy, and Eve is awareness, Magdalene is integration. Her presence in the suppressed Gospels reveals her as the one who understands the inner mysteries, not the miracles, not the rituals, but the real teachings, the nature of consciousness, the rebirth of the self, the union of the masculine and feminine energies within. Magdalene represents the archetype of the soul that has moved beyond rebellion and beyond curiosity into wisdom, a wisdom that unifies rather than divides. She is the awakened heart. She is the inner teacher. She is the part of you that does not seek authority outside yourself, because you have become your own sanctuary. This is why her portrayal as a prostitute was so crucial for early religious institutions. If people believed she was a teacher, a mystic, a partner in the spiritual lineage, it would imply that enlightenment is not the domain of a select few. It is available to all, especially through the feminine path of intuition, presence, and embodied spirituality. Together, these three women form a hidden trilogy of spiritual evolution. Lilith, the courage to be; Eve, the will to know; Magdalene, the wisdom to become. And within you, whether you identify as male, female, or beyond, their archetypes live as processes of awakening. We rebel, we seek, we understand. To understand the deeper mystery behind Lilith, Eve, and Magdalene, we must recognize that each of them embodies a spiritual paradox, one the ancient world understood but later systems rejected. Their suppression was not an accident. It was the result of a global shift away from balance, intuition, and inner gnosis toward hierarchical structures and external authority. This is why their stories seem contradictory, fragmented, or riddled with symbolism. The contradictions are the clues. Let us begin by looking at the first paradox. Lilith must leave in order for the sacred to return. In mystic traditions, every soul must face a moment where it becomes unacceptable to the world around it. This is the archetype of the exile. But exile in esoteric language is not punishment, it is initiation. Lilith's departure from Eden is the soul leaving the realm of imposed identity and stepping into the unknown wilderness, where both shadow and power reside. Her demonization across later texts reflects a universal truth. Systems that cannot control you will condemn you. But spiritually, Lilith's shadow form holds a secret. The aspects of ourselves that we exile, the desires we bury, the instincts we shame, the truths we fear, are the very parts that contain our untapped power. Thus, the paradox becomes clear. You discover your light by confronting your shadow. Then we turn to Eve, whose paradox is perhaps the most misunderstood. Awakening always feels like a fall. Consider the moment Eve eats from the tree of knowledge. The world does not crumble. What crumbles is her old perception. She becomes aware of herself as separate, vulnerable, mortal. This is the first shock of awakening, the realization that knowledge expands consciousness but also expands responsibility. It is painful. It is confusing. It feels like losing paradise. And yet, in mystical teachings across cultures, this fall is initiation into the path of self-awareness. Every seeker undergoes a personal Eden moment, when innocence must die so wisdom can be born. The serpent, too, carries a paradox. Condemned in scripture, yet revered in nearly every mystical tradition as the symbol of transformation, life force, and enlightenment. In Hindu, Egyptian, Greek, and Gnostic symbolism, the serpent is always a vessel of awakening. Only in later dogma does it become a symbol of corruption. Why? Because awakening threatens control. A person who knows themselves cannot be ruled. This brings us to the third paradox, Mary Magdalene. The feminine becomes dangerous only when it becomes wise. Magdalene's portrayal in the Gnostic texts is astonishing. She is not merely a companion of Jesus. She is the embodied Sophia, the feminine face of divine wisdom. Jesus, in those texts, does not teach her as a student. He reveals knowledge to her as an equal, someone capable of holding the inner mysteries. And this is where the paradox deepens. The Magdalene of the official canon is silent, repentant, submissive. The Magdalene of the forbidden Gospels is vocal, enlightened, and authoritative. She is both sinner and saint, fallen and exalted, two identities crafted by two very different worldviews. The suppressed version of Magdalene carries the same message that Lilith and Eve do. When women awaken, systems tremble. When the feminine rises, the old order fractures. But here is the esoteric truth. This is not about gender. Magdalene represents the integration of inner masculine and inner feminine energies, the union of intellect and intuition, logic and feeling, structure and flow. She is the culmination of the spiritual journey started by Lilith and Eve. If Lilith breaks the chains, and Eve opens the eyes, Magdalene opens the heart. These archetypes were never meant to be separate. Together, they form a map of awakening the ancients understood deeply, and one that modern seekers are being called to rediscover. Their suppression fractured the human psyche. Their remembrance heals it. With these paradoxes illuminated, we move to the next and most grounded part of our journey. How do we bring these archetypes into our daily lives? How do we awaken the divine feminine within ourselves? It is one thing to understand Lilith, Eve, and Magdalene as symbols. It is another to live their teachings, to integrate their archetypes into your consciousness so that their wisdom becomes part of your daily reality. These principles are not abstract ideas. They are pathways, each offering a distinct energy you can awaken within yourself. Let us begin with Lilith, the archetype of sovereignty. Lilith teaches you to reclaim the parts of yourself you were taught to suppress: your voice, your instincts, your boundaries, your desires. To embody Lilith is to stop apologizing for your existence. A simple practice to awaken Lilith's energy is the shadow retrieval ritual. Sit in silence and ask yourself, what part of me did I abandon to be accepted? What truth did I silence to keep the peace? What desire have I buried because it felt forbidden? Write these answers down without judgment. Then place your hand over the paper and say, I call back what I once exiled. This is not just symbolic, it is a psychological and spiritual act of permission. You are telling your unconscious mind that it is safe to be whole again. Next, we move to Eve, the archetype of awakening. Eve teaches that curiosity is sacred, that seeking truth is an act of courage. To integrate Eve is to embrace the parts of your mind that question, explore, and refuse to be complacent. A powerful exercise for embodying Eve is conscious inquiry. Throughout your day, whenever you encounter a belief, whether societal, religious, or personal, ask yourself, who taught me this? Is it true for me? Or did I inherit a truth that isn't mine? This practice slowly dismantles false narratives and opens your perception. Eve's energy awakens whenever you choose truth over conditioning, awareness over comfort, evolution over obedience. Finally, we turn to Magdalene, the archetype of integration and spiritual wisdom. To embody Magdalene is to balance the mind and the heart, the inner masculine and inner feminine. This is not a gendered concept. It is the harmony between thinking and feeling, logic and intuition, action and presence. A simple but profound Magdalene practice is the inner union meditation. Close your eyes and imagine two energies within you. One linear, focused, structured, the other flowing, receptive, intuitive. Visualize them moving toward each other, merging at the center of your chest. This symbolic union brings coherence to your consciousness. You begin making decisions not from fear, scattered emotion, or rigid logic, but from a place of wholeness. Magdalene's wisdom awakens through balance, through the marriage of your inner opposites. To bring all three archetypes together, try this daily intention. I honor my truth, I seek my truth, and I live my truth. Lilith honors, Eve seeks, Magdalene lives. This triad is a spiritual technology, a blueprint for inner transformation. As you integrate these energies, you may notice subtle shifts, a growing sense of personal authority, a deeper clarity of thought, a heightened intuitive awareness, a feeling of harmony within yourself. These are signs of awakening, because the divine feminine was never meant to be worshipped in statues or scriptures. It was meant to be awakened within you. If you look closely, you will notice something extraordinary about the stories of Lilith, Eve, and Magdalene. They were never meant to be separate. Somewhere along the timeline of history, their narratives were fragmented. One turned into a demon, one into a sinner, one into a silent figure standing behind male authority. But when you stitch their stories back together, the truth becomes unmistakable. They form a single path, a single initiation, a single evolution of the soul. Lilith teaches you to reclaim your sovereignty, the courage to stand in your truth even when the world demands your silence. Eve awakens your consciousness, the curiosity to question, to seek, to break the illusion of imposed paradise. Magdalene completes the journey, the wisdom to integrate shadow and light, mind and heart, masculine and feminine into a coherent, awakened self. This is the divine feminine the scriptures silenced. Not as a gender, not as a figure to worship, but as a force within you, a force of intuition, liberation, depth, wisdom, creativity, and inner knowing. It is the part of you that institutions could not control, so they told you to fear it instead. But now the old stories are resurfacing. The suppressed texts are returning. The hidden archetypes are calling out to be remembered. Maybe you are here because you feel that call. Maybe you've sensed for a long time that the version of spirituality handed down to us is incomplete, imbalanced, missing its other half. Reclaiming the divine feminine is not an act of rebellion against tradition. It is an act of healing, a return to wholeness. It is the recognition that true awakening requires both forces, both energies, both halves of the story. So the question you must sit with now is this: which archetype is calling you? Lilith's courage, Eve's curiosity, or Magdalene's wisdom? And more importantly, are you ready to answer? If this journey stirred something within you, if it opened a door, raised a question, or awakened a memory older than your present life, stay with this path. Explore deeper. Let your intuition lead you. And if you found this exploration meaningful, consider sharing your thoughts, your reflections, or your own awakening story in the comments. This channel is not just a space for learning. It is a space for remembering. Your journey has only just begun.